see so many folks here today, folks who are thinking about immigration. We may not agree on everything. I know I came out of the gate swinging for controversy a bit. I'm happy to talk in much more detail in the question and answers about policy matters. But for now, I'm just really grateful that you're all here tonight, bringing your open minds and a willingness to reflect on these issues and hopefully take action in this crux moment. But tonight, I want to step back from the immediate present a little bit. Instead, I want to reflect on kind of broader things that I think we need to understand about immigration and the border if we want to understand and take action on the challenges we face today.
Aaron?
Yeah.
I'm really sorry. We have had a technical difficulty and we have just now gone live.
Oh boy.
I so apologize. And I apologize to everyone who has been waiting for us to start. We started without you.
Oh boy.
So I apologize to Aaron and everyone. Can we start again? We have our executive director back, and sorry, ask Aaron to take a step back and have a rest, and I will.
Amy?
Start again. Yes, Amelia.
It's working now. There was a little bit of a lag, but you're caught up, so I think he can just start.
Okay, so I'm just going to say thank you all for joining us. I apologize for the delay. This is Erin Bobrow-Strain, the author of The Death and Life of Aida Hernandez, and we will start again as if it has all been going well.
Okay, so sorry, just to clarify, Amy, would you like me to take it from the top or just pick up where I was?
I believe we started right before that, the live stream started right before you started. I talked to you, so they missed the first 8 or 9 minutes of your talk.
Okay, so take it from the top.
So if you can take it from the top, thank you so much.
No problem, of course. Well, hello. Thank you for being here. I'm just really honored and grateful to be here tonight. Thankful for the Fort Vancouver Regional Public Library System. It's very cool as an author to get the chance to talk to folks who have, a lot of folks who have already read the book, and not just read the book, but maybe had a chance to discuss the book with other folks through these library programs. I really wrote this book with the idea that with the hope that people wouldn't read it as individuals, but would read it in community and read it talking to their neighbors and their friends and their family. So I'm really excited about that. And thank you to Amelia and to Michelle, and especially to Amy Scott, who really made this event happen and kind of went above and beyond the call of duty to make sure that everyone in Southwestern Washington who wanted a copy of the book could get one. But in the end, I am most grateful for all of you out there listening today, because here we are on this 204th day since Biden officially ended the Trump border emergency declaration, the declaration of the so-called emergency on the US-Mexico border. 204 days later, we are at a crux moment. Really a crux moment in the whole history of border and immigration policy. We are coming out of 4 years of a president whose go-to response for pretty much any issue was to scapegoat, dehumanize, criminalize immigrants, immigrant community members. A president whose number one policy goal was to gum up and dismantle and paralyze the legal immigration system as much as possible. Actually, I think it's important to note there, to remember that despite the big talk, Trump did almost nothing significant policy-wise focused on so-called illegal immigration. The vast majority of his administration's focus, the vast majority of the focus of his advisors like Stephen Miller was on dismantling and paralyzing the system through which people legally immigrate to the United States, particularly the procedures through which people exercise their legal right to claim asylum in the United States and to hear their asylum cases adjudicated. Now we have a new president, and I think, and I'm curious to hear what you all think about this, whether you agree with this, that a lot of folks have stopped paying attention, or so much attention to immigration. People who were flooding their representatives' phones with calls about kids in cages, who were donating money to challenge Trump's unconstitutional immigration rules in court, who are showing up in all kinds of different ways for undocumented neighbors in their community. There's a sense now that maybe, you know, we can focus on other issues, right? There's an election, it's taken care of. Let me be clear, the immigrant rights movement, the movement largely led by young immigrants and the children of immigrants, is still very much fighting courageously, putting themselves on the line for change. Communities on the border, like the ones we'll talk about today, are still fighting and navigating this system. It's just that now, I think they're doing it with a lot less widespread support. And I guess maybe support isn't the right word here, because the polls actually tell us that support for undocumented immigrants, for comprehensive immigration reform among both Democrats and Republicans is right now at unprecedentedly high historic levels. Public support for undocumented people went up under the Trump administration. So maybe that people aren't acting on that support as much. And I know we have a lot of other issues on our minds, a lot of other issues demanding attention right now. But the result of this is that, yes, some things have gotten better for migrants in these past 204 days, but most things have not, including many of the most brutal policies that I describe in The Death and Life of Aida Hernandez, the separation of families, the mandatory detention rules, the lightning speed deportation without a right to an attorney or an appeal that Aida goes through, the endless deportation flights sending asylum seekers to face death or torture that Emma feared. These are still happening today. In some cases, they're actually happening more under the Biden administration than they were before. But just this week, actually, there is this one small glimmer of hope for those who want immigration reform on the legislative front. It takes the form of the Senate budget resolution, which passed in the wee hours of the morning, I guess it was yesterday, and included a kind of vague but really important instructions to Congress to chart a path to legalization for many undocumented people in the United States through the reconciliation process, thereby possibly avoiding a filibuster in the Senate on immigration reform. And this turn of events has many immigrant rights leaders saying that we are now the closest we have been to comprehensive immigration reform since Ronald Reagan, the closest we have been since Ronald Reagan. That's new. That's exciting to me, at least. But it is far from being a law. And there are a lot of hurdles ahead, a lot of ways this can go off the rails. So it's an opportunity, but it's only an opportunity if folks really come back to paying attention to immigration and the border and make another big push or for pressure around this. So it makes me really happy to see so many folks here today thinking about immigration. And I know that we may not agree on everything. I certainly came out of the gate swinging for controversy a bit with my opening. I'm happy to talk in detail as much as folks want during the question and answers about policy matters. But for now, I'm just really grateful that you all are here bringing your open minds and your willingness to reflect on immigration and the border, and hopefully to act on it in this crux moment. So today, though, I want to step back from this like really immediate present that I've started with. And I want to reflect on some broader questions, some broader histories that I think we need to understand if we want to understand and really be able to act on the immediate challenges today. And these are the questions really at the heart of this book. How did the border get to be the way it is today? What's it like for border residents and migrants who are navigating this border that we've made? And how could the immigration and border system be different? How could we imagine a different border, a different immigration system? The book really emerged out of my time teaching about the history of immigration policy at Whitman College, as Amelia mentioned in the introduction, and as well as out of my time doing immigrant rights activism in Eastern Washington, but especially out of years I spent on the US-Mexico border. And so it's there that I'll open, and it's there that the book opens. So we open on the border. It's 2008, 13 years ago. We are perched between the United States and Mexico, between life and death. And a Mexican ambulance is speeding towards the port of entry and Arizona from Mexico. And Aida is lying in the ambulance. Her face is swollen and purple. Her arms are torn. She's bleeding from 9 stab wounds in the stomach and the torso. And the ambulance is racing along the latest border wall. Agua Prieta, Sonora, Mexico, where Aida was born, is on the left. On her right, Douglas, Arizona, where she lived from age 8 until 20, until just a tiny misstep a month earlier led to her deportation. And these two towns, Agua Prieta and Douglas, have been so closely intertwined for so long that some people just call them Dogla Prieta, one community, united, not divided by a border. Residents who are just a little bit older than Aida will remember a time when summer baseball games were played where home plate was in the United States and the outfield was in Mexico. Language and families and businesses and culture have blurred this border every day since these two towns were founded. But now it's 2008. And at that point, 15 years of bipartisan border hardening have driven a wedge between these two communities. Emergency medical transfers across the border are still routine, though, unless something goes wrong. And Frank Hone, a Douglas paramedic, watches from the US side as everything goes wrong, as the Mexican ambulance pulls into the port of entry and unloads. Officers surround Aida's gurney, refusing to let her pass. Family members stream in from both sides of the line, arguing. Someone knocks into her gurney and Aida shrieks awake. Please, I have a US citizen son. Let me pass. There's a stunned silence on both sides. Sunday shoppers crossing through the port of entry from the Walmart in Arizona stop to stare. And the paramedic sees his chance and whisks Aida out of one of the most heavily secured spots in the American Southwest. A few minutes later, Arizona Lifeline 2 lifts off and sets a course for a hospital in Tucson. As it rises, it skims over high-tech surveillance towers and what was then the country's largest border patrol station. It rises past the Mule Mountains. It soars over the last Border Patrol highway checkpoint, and then it breaks free of the border. And the paramedic looks down at his clipboard and reads her name for the first time. I've done everything I can do, he thinks. but Aida Hernandez is not going to make it. She does survive, of course, those of you who have read the book. I won't give away what happens for those who haven't read the book, but weeks later, she returns to Douglas, to her home. She's sutured and she's stitched and she's twisted by pain that goes far beyond her physical wounds in ways that she has not yet begun to comprehend. And she gets there and she sits, she kneels and holds her 4-year-old son, Gabriel, as tight as her wounds allow. And she looks in his eyes and she promises, Gabriel, I will never leave you again. And then the hardest part of her story begins. This is a book about the border we've made, about trauma, about the courageous struggles of young immigrants fighting for survival and justice on that border. And as many of you know, it centers primarily on the story of one young woman, Aida Hernandez. And most of it takes place when Aida is in her teens and early 20s trying to do typical things, right? Pass algebra. She's watching Friends on TV and dreaming of leaving her small town for New York City. She sets her sights on a dance scholarship. She drinks a little too much with her sisters, and she's coming to terms with her bisexuality. But she is growing up undocumented in Douglas during the 1990s and the 2000s, just as policies crafted far from the border came crashing down on that town, placing it at the center of the storm of immigration debates for much of the next 20 years, and turning Douglas and Agua Prieta turning Douglas into one of the most heavily policed small towns in the United States. Aida is also growing up poor, which brings us to a larger US story that underpins this border story. And I think this part maybe is not intuitive to a lot of us who live far from the border or don't have as direct connection to immigration. And we mostly think about the border as kind of a backdrop for our national immigration drama, but it's crucial that actually, for most of its history, the border was a blurry afterthought in Douglas. What really gave the town meaning was copper and union work. Douglas was the home of a vibrant copper industry and a powerful unionized Mexican-American working class that incidentally won one of the most important Supreme Court cases in the post-war period guaranteeing the right to organize. But in 1987, the year of Aida's birth, Phelps Dodge Mining Company, inspired by Reagan-era anti-union campaigns, closed the Douglas copper operations and fled to less union-friendly lands. Almost overnight, the bad air cleared and the good jobs disappeared, and Douglas was never the same. And you know, as in so many Black and brown communities across the country hammered by industrial plant closures, deindustrialization in this Mexican-American town was not met with elegies or calls for empathy. Deindustrialization was met with militarized policing and mass incarceration, albeit with a border twist. In the space of Aida's childhood, Douglas went from copper company town to Homeland Security company town, from smokestacks to surveillance towers. And so growing up poor and undocumented in this context causes what I call Aida's first death, a social death. And what I mean by that is that Aida is fully part of her community. She is an active member and a maker of this community, and yet she's denied real membership in it. She's a citizen without citizenship. She is cut off from rights and opportunities that should be hers. And because of this, we know that she is going to pay a very high price for the kinds of ordinary, small mistakes, missteps that any young person growing up anywhere might make. Aida has to fight for her life, literally fight for her life several more times in the book. But her real struggle, really the heart of this book, the suspense at the heart of this book, is the struggle to get from that place of social death to a place where she isn't just surviving the world we have made on the US-Mexico border, she's thriving. She's truly alive. So as this all plays out, right, there's lots of spoilers and twists in the book, and I don't want to tell too much of the story. Today, I'm mostly going to talk about how the book came about, and then gesture to some of the conclusions that I think hopefully arise from it. And then I'd love to hear your discussion. So I first went to the US-Mexico border in the fall of 1993. And it was the start of a lifelong connection for me to the borderlands, to their beauty, to their creativity, to their cultural richness. I think these are things that sometimes we miss. When we only talk about the border in terms of border crisis, we miss that this is a rich, beautiful, creative landscape, and really a unique place in the world where the US and Mexico come together. I had gone there to work as an activist and educator. And unbeknownst to me, unbeknownst to everyone, the fall of 1993 was a pivotal time for border policy in general, really a historic moment, because unbeknownst to all of us, a new approach to border security was getting tested in El Paso, Texas, right at that moment. And this would end up becoming the single-minded center of our whole approach to the border and to immigration ever since. By a fluke, I actually happened to be in El Paso the week it began in September 1993. Basically, it started like this. Following a Clinton-era INS strategy blueprint, the local Border Patrol sector chief pulled his agents from mobile patrols in the countryside and just lined them up one after another along just one short stretch of the downtown El Paso border. And the idea was that by completely shutting down the relatively easy to cross urban area parts of the border with agents at first and then later with walls, migrants would be forced out into the more hostile mountains and desert terrain outside of town. The chief figured that this would make border crossing more dangerous, therefore more expensive and more deadly, and that fewer people would do it as a result. And this strategy came to be called prevention through deterrence. And this was the government deliberately weaponizing deserts in the service of deadly deterrence. In fact, a government report from this moment says that an early sign of success of this strategy would be increasing deaths on the southern border. Over the next 28 years, we would see the government deploy many new weapons of deterrence. They didn't really call them that. If they called them anything, they might have used the Orwellian label consequence delivery system. But we're talking about Border Patrol agents slashing water bottles left in the desert by humanitarian groups, kids dying in cages, the withholding of vaccines to people in immigration detention, deporting women alone in strange cities at 3 a.m., locking immigrants without criminal records who are pursuing legal immigration claims the right way in detention conditions that are worse and more poorly regulated than what you'd find in a medium security criminal prison. Forcing Central American asylum seekers to wait in dangerous conditions in Mexico, as we've seen recently. The heaping of criminal punishments onto civil immigration matters. Under Biden recently, flying expelled asylum seekers thousands of miles from both the border and their homes and dumping them with a good luck. When you see all of these things today, know that they are not aberrations or the work of bad apples or just artifacts of Trump. They are the results of a 28-year bipartisan strategy designed to make the border crossing more dangerous and cruel, supposedly to deter migrants. And it's important to note that almost all of prevention through deterrence is still in place. It predates Trump, it continues to exist. And, you know, the Border Patrol, or Customs and Border Protection, is the country's largest and most heavily funded police force. And they are certainly up to the task of enacting this strategy, but not all of prevention through deterrence is actually done by government agents. I'm guessing that probably, whether you admit it or not, some of you have probably watched the Sicario movies or the Netflix series Narcos. Some of you are like, yeah, okay, I know what you're talking about. And to watch that genre of television or film, you would get the idea, you would think that violent cartels preying on vulnerable women were the enemies of the US government. In fact, by the strict logic of prevention through deterrence, think about it, right? They are our allies. They are force multipliers, right? If the strategy is designed to make crossing the border more dangerous and more cruel, cartels preying on vulnerable people are our allies. We have outsourced some of the worst parts of our effort to make crossing the border dangerous to cartels, and then we act shocked by their savagery. So remember this from this part of the talk. The border isn't broken. It is working more or less as intended, and that is the problem. Back in the 1990s, the strategy spread really quickly. It clicked instantly with President Clinton's desire to take a page from the Republicans' tough on crime dog whistle playbook. Later, Obama would bet wrongly, tragically wrongly, that wholehearted support for border militarization and prevention through deterrence could be traded for immigration reform. But it just turns out that ever more spectacular, ever more expensive forms of deterrence had bipartisan and enduring political appeal. And to give you a sense of just the magnitude of this, I calculated for the book that we have expended the inflation-adjusted equivalent of more than 2 Marshall Plans for the reconstruction of Europe after World War II, funding deterrence-centric immigration enforcement since the policy rolled out. And of course, none of this achieved its stated goal. Deterrence does a lot of things politically, does things in our country, economically, it does things. It's productive, it's useful for many people, companies, institutions, but we have 28 years of research now that really clearly shows that one thing it does not do is deter migrants. Instead, by the late 1990s, what it had done was it had begun to funnel a continent's worth of migration from Texas, from California, right into southern Arizona and the border's most deadly deserts. And one of the very first places that strategy came crashing down in the summer of 1997 was the small town, the small border communities of Douglas, Arizona, and Agua Prieta, Sonora, where Aida was growing up and where much of this book is set. People in these communities reeled as politicians, the media, militias descended on their town. They chafed against the militarization of daily life, the imposition of new divides in their community, but they also came to depend on border security and insecurity spending as an economic lifeblood, right? Border security spending and spending by people trying to evade border security became an economic lifeblood in these towns. By 2014, 1 in 7 employed adult men in Douglas worked for law enforcement. A vast border security industrial complex has grown up around prevention through deterrence. We often like to focus on private immigration detention centers as the villain of this story, and that's part of the story, but it's much more than that. It's the small town budgets that rely on Homeland Security grants. And not just on the border, not just Douglas, but look at Yakima in Washington, right? Which gets funding, much needed funding for its airport because it allows its airport to be used for, to be the Pacific Northwest hub for deportation flights. It's also the Latina Douglas High School grad who looks at her deindustrialized town and sees the Border Patrol as the only good job left, certainly the only job with benefits and a sense of purpose. Or it's the small businesses throughout Washington state, including Vancouver, that benefit from contracts with Immigration and Customs Enforcement or Border Patrol to provide everything from office furniture to weapons, to surveillance systems and travel logistics. A whole diverse way of life has taken form that depends not on improving conditions on the border, but on permanent border crisis for its very existence. A whole range of communities, politicians, companies that have a stake in maintaining a permanent border crisis has grown up. And it really begs the question, I think a question that the book raises, is what would a just transition from this vast border security industrial complex look like for all the people who depend on it for lifeblood? So back in January 2014, I went to Douglas and to Agua Prieta to try to understand how people were living their lives in this context. And early in the process of my research, I met a woman named Rosy Mendoza, and she became one of my main guides to the community. And those of you who have read the book already, you know that she is a badass, formerly undocumented social worker who works with victims of domestic and sexual violence on the border. And her story figures heavily in the book, but she also connected Aida and me, and she encouraged Aida to tell her story. It took a long time for us to actually meet. And there's kind of a funny, very small town kind of story in the book about how we finally did meet. But suffice it to say that Aida and I met for the first time on a wintry day in the 10th Street Park. And we sat by the fountain and she told me her story. And I had not planned at all to write a book about one person, and much less to place violence against women at the heart of a border book. But I knew almost immediately after Aida and I spoke that she had this powerful message for everyone who looks at the border and immigration from a privileged position. And I knew that our current approach to border security can't be understood separate from the many, many ways it makes women's lives less secure, not more secure. Aida's story left me shaking on that day in 2014. It is filled with such intense pain and suffering. But the thing that really moved me most that day was not the pain, not the suffering. It was the fierce pride that she conveyed as she told it. She exuded this kind of irrepressible brio and wit and power from having survived by the seat of her pants time and time again, and having fought against huge odds for a place in the United States, for herself, for her son. And so amid all of that suffering in that story was a message that the sheer act of surviving the world we have made on the border is itself a form of dignity and worth that is as valuable as any privileged person's accomplishments. And that hit me. The writer Hector Tobar notes that spirit of agency and wit is often left out of reporting that portrays immigrants as passive victim props for tragic border tales. I wanted to try to convey something of that spirit. Of course, the idea of having someone write a book about you and your life wouldn't necessarily click with a lot of people, but it did for Aida. And we talked about it for months, the idea, and I wavered. Aida was firm. She said, "Aaron, I have dealt with the worst possible people you can imagine already, and they have not stopped me. Telling my story is a way to turn all that suffering into something that can reach people and can make a difference." And from there, the hard work of research began, because getting a story that's that sensitive and difficult right meant doing hours and hours of interviews with Aida, with her family, with her friends, with people whose lives intersected with hers, cross-checking those accounts with hundreds of pages of school and court and immigration and medical and other records, listening to court recordings, talking with attorneys and physicians and law enforcement, government officials, community leaders, psychologists, to verify the plausibility of her stories. And through it all, this process, and I knew also that coming into this project as a white male, even someone with experience on the border, with immigration rights, there was a huge risk of me getting the story wrong, of misusing the story, right. So what that required was trying to make this as collaborative a process as possible with Aida, with her family, with the other people who appear in the story, and also throughout the whole life of the project, meeting with, sharing drafts of the book with activists and educators, people of color and women who really understood, yes, the possible benefits of a project like this, but also the real risks. And it was the kind of the encouragement that came out of that dialogue and that process that moved this book forward. And every time Aida and I met, I made 3 commitments to her. First was that if she said something that later she thought was embarrassing or she didn't want in the book, we could take it out. That's not something that is normal within journalists circles, but I think within the world of activism and ethnography, from which I come, that's important. The second part was that we would make it as collaborative as possible, and that she would shape the story and she would be reading drafts and we would be talking it through together. The third thing is that the third thing is that I would do my best to portray her not as a demon or as a saint, but as a real, complex, flawed, brilliant person. And that her story would matter in itself, not just as an illustration for a set of political arguments. And that last piece about messy humanity is central. Not just because it's so important for conveying dignity and trying to write a meaningful story, but because it also gets to the heart of what the message was that emerged out of this whole collaboration. If there's one thing I hope people take out of this book, it's this, that it's impossible to overstate how much our US immigration debates, even our sense of the US as a nation of immigrants, turn on the impossible binary between the flawless, high-achieving, perfect, quote-unquote, good immigrant who maybe deserves sympathy and rights, and the quote unquote bad criminal immigrant who deserves all the punishment she gets. As Rosy Mendoza often says, humans make mistakes, immigrants can't. But Aida's life, for those of you who have read the book, you know, it does not disavow her many mistakes or solicit your pity. If you follow the threads of Aida's death, the one she survived, and her life, the one she is still fighting for, you will see that they challenge those of us who look at the immigration and the border from a more privileged position to recognize that undocumented immigrants whose messy human lives don't fit into our good, bad binary, which is to say most people, right, are still deeply part of their communities. They are active members and makers of their community, regardless of whether they fit external images of perfection or innocence or high achievement. And they should be legally recognized as such, not subject to an immigration system that is literally designed to inflict trauma. Okay, I think I'll stop there and open it up to questions, and we can continue to talk as we go forward.
Thanks so much, Erin. So I'm going to remind everyone right now that we have an email that you can send messages to if you wish, and you can also, of course, put them in the YouTube chat, and that will be, their email is RevReads@FVRL.org. That's RevReads@FVRL.org. And I will start us off with a question. How is Aida doing? Has she been positively or negatively at all affected by the book and the publicity?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, Amy. Yeah, so we communicate a lot still. And, you know, for those of you who have read the book ends with Aida in a pretty difficult spot. And what happened was that she did end up having to go into the New York City homeless shelter system. And that was in many ways really rough, brutal, her and her son. But they landed in a family homeless shelter run by the city that had on-site counseling and kind of a trauma-focused approach. And it also gave her housing stability for a year. So in some ways, it actually turned out well. And with that time, Aida was able to get her GED. She finished her GED. And then once that passed, she actually had just the unbelievable, I mean, I feel like Aida has so much bad luck in this book. So many things just go as wrongly as possible. But she had the amazing luck to win the New York City subsidized apartment lottery. And so she was able to get a subsidized apartment in the city. And she applied for and won a position in this very cool program that trains young queer people of color to be peer-to-peer trauma counselors. And she got into this, and she got trained to be a peer mental health worker, which is kind of the dream, right? Because all throughout our time together through the book, she talks about how much she idolizes Rosy, the social worker, and how she wants to do that. And now she is in fact trained as a peer mental health counselor. And the thing that allows her to do that whole program is the royalties from the book, right? I forgot to, many of you, you don't know this, I'm focused on this, but I did this thing that I've been dreading for years, which is that I somehow lost 3 pages of my talk notes towards the end. So I was trying to remember what was in my talk and ad lib it. And one thing I left out was that Aida and I made a decision in the process of writing the book that we would split the proceeds for the book in 3 ways. A third would go to her. A third would go to an organization on the US-Mexico border that works with people dealing with sexual and domestic violence on the border. And a third would go to me to pay for things like paying the fact checker and doing promotional travel, that sort of thing. And so Aida was able to take her part of the proceeds from the book and allow her to live while she did that peer mental health training program. Now, actually, she has a job as a peer mental health intervention specialist. It's really exciting, which is not to say it's not difficult, right? The pandemic was brutal. The pandemic was kind of a lost year for her, a year that put her deep in debt, and really in a rough position financially, thanks to the pandemic, and complex PTSD is something that you don't get over, right? She is continually struggling with that. And so often it's kind of a feeling of waiting for the other shoe to drop. But there's been incredible progress. And part of it is a small part of it is the book money, and a small part of it is something Aida told me the other day was that, like, she grew up thinking that, she said, like, I grew up like thinking that the country thought I was trash, that I was a criminal, that I was worthless. And now I hear messages from book groups and library groups all over the country, readers who think that I'm a hero. And that kind of created a kind of an incredible confidence. And I think that was also really a powerful and I think for me unexpected result of the book.
That's really wonderful to hear. Thanks so much for giving us that update. So I have kind of a question with a follow-up question. The Border Patrol is a major employer in Douglas. What might be the future of the community if we did achieve comprehensive immigration reform and the border became less militarized?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And yeah, I mean, and it gets to the heart of the way issues interrelate, right? This is a story about immigration on the border, but it's also a story about deindustrialization. It's a story about infrastructure investment. You know, we're thinking about infrastructure packages going through. Of course, there's also a climate story. If you think about Central American migrants coming to the border now. Yeah, it's really difficult to imagine what that just future is if what we're looking at is just getting rid of this behemoth border industrial complex without then reinvesting in those communities of color, right? Reindustrializing, finding the new economies, right? There's potential there, right? I mean, the US-Mexico border is a trade hub. For years, border officials, border mayors have complained, like, why are they investing so much money in men with guns doing enforcement and not investing money in people to facilitate trade on the border, to make the kind of back and forth trade between the US and Mexico smoother and more efficient, the kind of thing that could actually buoy that border communities and border regions, right? So it definitely is going to require rethinking economies to come out of this. One thing that just gives you a sense, I mentioned the Marshall Plan in terms of magnitude and scale, but just to think about the Border Patrol for a second, the immigration enforcement budget is larger than the budget for the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, the Secret Service, and the US Marshals Service combined. Right? So think about that when people talk about, when politicians call for doubling the Border Patrol. We're talking about an agency that's budget is already larger than all of the other federal law enforcement agencies, with enough money left over to run the national park system.
Wow, that is something to think about. So a follow-up to that is, someone says, I'm wondering if the ranchers affected near Douglas have brought lawsuits against the Border Patrol or other government entities for the damage being done to their property.
Yeah, so, and for those who haven't read the book or don't know the situation, right? As I mentioned, a key part of prevention through deterrence is pushing migration into the most dangerous, most rugged, remote territory, which in the American Southwest is often ranch land. So folks who live on the border, ranch on the border, have been subjected to a constant stream of migration and drug trafficking through their territory. Fences are torn down that are important for containing livestock, for managing livestock. It's damaging to the land in many ways. And I think it's crucial really to remember that this is not immigrants' fault, right? Immigrants have been pushed there by our policy choices, right? We essentially told them to go out in this landscape, right? So, we are complicit. We are the maker of that environmental damage, of that impact to ranchers. It's important not to scapegoat migrants, right? That's just like you wouldn't blame the ranchers, you shouldn't blame the migrants, because that's blaming the victim, right? Our policy choices have pushed people out into that landscape. And ranchers are a kind of a mixed group, right? Because often they're fairly sympathetic with right-wing policies. There were a number of prominent ranchers outside of Douglas that affiliated themselves with the different militia groups that came down, supposedly, to play war games and supposedly protect the border at various points. But there are also a lot of ranchers who realize that this is a policy matter created in Washington, and that it will take, changes at that level. One of the rancher characters ranchers who features in the book, right, had a really great insight, right? She wasn't blaming migrants. She was saying, really, like, what we need is immigration reform, right? These people should not be traveling through the deserts. We should have a system where people are regulated. They're, they go through vetting and they get a visa, right? A legal system that brings people into the country at the level that we need. And so, yeah, some ranchers ranchers actually originally were very staunchly pro-Border Patrol. Extremely pro-Border Patrol, and many still are, just because of political sympathies. But that has worn thin over the years. I don't know of lawsuits in particular. Maybe the person who asked the question knows of one in specific that I don't know about. But yeah, there's been a wearing thin of that kind of full-on support for border enforcement, as the people have realized how much damage it does to human beings, to livestock, and to the land.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question that, could you please repeat the 3 questions you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation?
Sure. Yeah, and then these aren't questions, these are kind of questions that run through and inform, and really, like, that were on my mind as I was writing the book. There's no place in the book where I say, like, here we will answer this question, here we will answer this question. It's more kind of the underlying idea. But they were, how did the border get to be the way it is today? A historical question. How is it that communities and people on the border are navigating this world? And I think that's an important one too, because often when we see reporting on the border, we're talking about law enforcement and migrants crossing the border, people who are passing through the border. We don't hear as much about the actual communities, right? People who have long-term roots on the border aren't passing through. So how are those communities navigating the border that we've made through our policy choices? And third, how could we imagine a different border? How could things be different? And I think that some of the historical piece gets at that question, right? When we think about the fact that up until relatively recently, the US-Mexico border was completely open. Until the 1970s, there were essentially unlimited legal immigration visas for people coming from Mexico to work in the United States. You know, we have, this is the idea that we have a hard, closed, militarized border is relatively new. It doesn't have to be that way. We have most of the history of the border was not like that. Most of human history was not like that. In fact, border and immigration controls are really didn't come around until the late 19th century anywhere in the world. So we can imagine other ways of having a border by thinking about how closely intertwined and how well it worked when Agua Prieta and Douglas were Dogla Prieta, one community united, not divided. And also thinking about how we can change our understanding of I think what I would call like the kind of deservingness politics that surrounds immigration, where there's this presumption that we, the US citizens, get to decide whether this person is deserving of the scarce gift of legal residence or citizenship, to thinking more broadly about the fact that undocumented folks are already members and makers of our community, right? They are contributing to these communities, they're making these communities, and really should be, you know, and that their lives, their messy, complicated lives don't fit into this good immigrant, bad immigrant binary. We have to kind of get rid of that idea that there's the good immigrants who deserve rights and then the bad immigrants who deserve punishment, and think about this in terms of humanity.
Thank you. We have kind of a complicated question that I'm going to try to paraphrase a little bit. Given the very many interconnections between immigration and the socioeconomic, political issues and dysfunctions, and the complicity of both parties to do meaningful immigration reform, where and what do you see as the points of most optimal to attack the brick/capstone to pull down that might bring down the wall, pun intended?
Oh boy, I wish I had the perfect blueprint for change. I mean, I can talk a little bit about what's out there at the moment, and what I think it's, it has some great benefits, and but what its limits are. I think no one is actually, there's not a clear message in the Senate reconciliation proposal for what exactly should happen, other than there should be a pathway to legalization. But the thought is that it would probably mirror the House bills that have already been passed, which is the American Dream and Promise Act, which would provide a pathway to legal status and eventual citizenship for dreamers, as well as people under temporary protective status. And then the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which, as the name suggests, would give a very long and arduous, extremely difficult path to legal status and citizenship for farm workers. That one is slightly more problematic because it has the danger of tying farm workers to the whims of farmers, and it creates a situation where farm workers need to be continually certified by farmers that they are working in agriculture for X number of years and X number of days, and if you miss that, you're off the path to legalization. So it gives farmers the power to, it could potentially give farmers the power to say, if you don't do this work that, I want you to do for this wage, I'm not going to certify you. And you're off the path to legalization, right? It gives farmers a lot of power. But again, these are big starts, dreamers, temporary protective status folks, farm workers, huge. Even if we did all that though, and I think we should, it legalizes a lot of undocumented people who are in the country and have been in the country for a very long time, right? The average length of time an undocumented person has lived in the United States is more than 10 years. Even if we legalized folks through these bills, it would still leave the really punitive, unforgiving immigration laws that were in play in Aida's story in place, right? The expedited removal, in which low-level law enforcement officer acts as judge, jury, and executioner in Aida's speed deportation with no right to an attorney or a right to appeal, and kind of sets her off on the journey that you read about. The mandatory detention laws that require the government to detain people who are not a threat to their community at all, who are not flight risks, right? Those are all kind of came to us originally through a set of 1996 laws, ERIRA and EDPA, that passed under the Clinton administration and have gotten stricter and stricter and more punitive over time. I think we need to work on repealing those or dramatically transforming those. If you're looking for something really immediate right now, and I hope some of you are, one is calling your representatives in the House, particular at this moment, and the Senate to make this comprehensive immigration reform happen. And the other is calling about something called Title 42. And this is one of those policies that were really brutal policies put into place by Trump that Biden has flat out refused to get rid of. And people have been calling for Biden to get rid of Title 42, and it hasn't happened. And let me tell a little bit about what Title 42 is. Title 42 is a very old law, a public health law. I think it was originally designed to allow the government to stop ships coming into harbors that might have people carrying diseases aboard the ships. Trump invoked it in March 2020 with saying that we needed this to protect the country from COVID. From my perspective, Trump saying he wanted to do something to protect us from COVID is maybe the first sign that this was a little fishy. We later learned that actually Trump pushed for this Title 42 to be invoked over the opposition from CDC scientists who said that it had no basis in public health or COVID protection. And basically what Title 42 does is it allows the government to summarily expel, without a hearing, without an appeal, without an attorney, just immediately expel essentially asylum seekers crossing the border. And the key thing about Title 42 is, right, there are other like expedited removal. If you were like a migrant who wasn't an asylum seeker, who is coming, the kind of the classic story of like to build a better life, you could already be immediately expelled through expedited removal, right? We had that mechanism. Title 42 allowed the Trump administration to do something that it had wanted to do for a really long time, but kept getting blocked by the courts, which was completely stop the asylum system. And Title 42, under the guise of public health, says that the government can immediately expel anyone before they have a chance to claim asylum. That's the key part, right? Right? If they claim asylum, by our own laws, by international treaties, we have to hear out their case, right? But Title 42 allows us to expel them before they can make that asylum claim. And under this Title 42, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of asylum seekers have been sent back to their countries of origin, first by Trump, now by Biden. Flights, deportation flights or expulsion flights are running constantly, sending people who are fleeing violence back to death and to torture. And the irony of it is that it does nothing for COVID, right? And it's ridiculous that it even is framed in terms of COVID, because hundreds of thousands of people cross the US-Mexico border every day without COVID testing, without any kind of restriction, right? There's still open movement for US citizens across the US-Mexico border. So like, for example, the person who runs a US factory in Mexico, but lives in the United States and is crossing back and forth. People who fly to the immigrants who fly to the United States from, say, Mexico and arrive at an airport, not subject to Title 42, right? So it's really designed only to target people who would be seeking asylum on the southern border. And it doesn't do anything for COVID. So it would be great to really finally force Biden to get rid of Title 42. And end that summary expulsion and really start to reinstate the asylum system. So those are two good places to start if you're looking for places. One is calling about this, moving forward on the path to legalization laid out in the Senate reconciliation proposal. And the other is calling around Title 42. Those are kind of immediate things, not necessarily, the immigration reform part, the Senate reconciliation is pretty foundational, but the Title 42 it could be gotten rid of easily if there was a little political pressure.
Those are great kind of immediate actions that we can take. Thanks very much, Aaron. And we're going to have to end it there. Thank you. You've gone over, and thank you for starting again and dealing with our technical difficulties. Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for watching this YouTube live stream, which will be remain on YouTube, so you can tell people to watch it. I might do a little editing to make it work a little bit at the beginning. So subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell to get notifications when we post recorded items. Have a good night and good conversations. Thank you, Aaron, so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming tonight.
Good night, everyone. Okay.